Hey, everybody. Welcome to our session today. I'm excited about this one. It's a very important topic. Also, the book, which we'll obviously be getting into a lot in general, is one of my personal favorites, business thriller. So it gets a little juicy too. I always tell people this is like my People magazine. These are my beach readers because they're just so in depth. And Maureen and her co-author Elliot did not disappoint on that realm. So a lot of really good stuff. We are here today. First of all, I'm Kate Brodock. I'm CEO of Women 2.0, general partner at the W Fund. And we are here today with Maureen Farrell, who is one of the co-authors of The Cult of We. Full title, The Cult of We, WeWork, Adam Newman, and the Great Startup Delusion. This book really goes into depth on a couple of different angles, obviously charts WeWork specifically, but really talks about, generally speaking, this industry that most of us are in right now of startups, investing, company growth, high scale, Silicon Valley type of stuff. Also definitely is a really good outline of internal culture. Certainly some readings in this book on what in most cases probably should not be repeated inside a company on many different levels. And hopefully as we go through some of this stuff, we're going to wrap it up also with hearing from Maureen about some of the more important learnings that we might be able to hear or might be able to learn from this book specifically, but obviously as kind of a glimpse and a template of what might be happening in the industry as well. So without further ado, welcome Maureen. And I'm going to have you just start off, give us a little bit of context. Can you talk to us about where this book came from?
Sure. First of all, Kate, thank you so much for having me. Really excited to talk to you and your whole group here about the book. So my colleague, Elliot Brown, and I were both reporters at the Wall Street Journal. I just left very recently to join the New York Times. I covered IPOs and Elliot Brown covered real estate. And Elliot had really been covering, he covered real estate first, and then he moved out to San Francisco from New York to cover venture capital. So it was sort of WeWork intersected both areas. He started covering WeWork really in 2013. He first met Adam. He heard about this, wild entrepreneur, this real estate startup with this sort of shocking valuation. Even at that time, I think when he maybe first came across it, it was like $1 billion company. And he was surprised because it really didn't have that much office space. It seemed like an interesting idea. He met Adam, and Adam quickly sort of reprimanded him for covering it, or just was like perplexed because he was like, "You're the real estate reporter. Why is a real estate reporter covering WeWork? Don't you have a community reporter who should be covering this?" So anyway, he became fascinated by the company. Obviously over the years, things just it got bigger and bigger and bigger, more and more decoupled as far as he could see from the metrics underlying real estate companies. And then I came in later as I covered private capital markets, these big fundraisings, like with the SoftBank Vision Fund. So it was popping up more and more. There was a small cohort of companies that were obviously going to be the most interesting IPOs: Airbnb, Uber, Lyft. So I was watching it. Basically, we were writing more and more stories as it was getting closer to this potential IPO in September 2019, hearing more, seeing more and more red flags. And then basically, I think we'd both easily say the almost IPO of WeWork, the ouster of Adam Newman, the precipitous fall that almost ended the company's life altogether, was one of the craziest reporting experiences in our entire career. And out of that, we're talking a little bit about a book. Adam wound up resigning in September 2019 so abruptly. It was shocking that this man could leave his own company. And we had a book idea. We wound up getting a book deal in like a day or two. There was just so much interest. We'd written like a paragraph of a proposal. And yeah, it was that. And it's just to quickly wrap up this long-winded intro that I'm giving is we thought we knew a lot of the story, I think, going into it. I mean, we've been reporting on the twists and turns. We kept on reporting throughout 2019. And then we had a lot more time to take a step back. And I think constantly throughout the process, we were shocked by everything we learned that we did not know, even thinking we knew a lot.
Yeah, that's what what a journey to be shocked in the first place and then dive deeper and just continue to be shocked and shocked and shocked. It's really remarkable. So let's dig in first, because one of the phenomenon that happened here was the founder. And so Adam, as you represent throughout this entire book, is certainly a unique personality of founder. And this is it's funny, I'm trying to disconnect myself from having read the book, but what in your mind was it about Adam Newman, both from the very get-go all the way through, that really drove what happened?
Sure. So I think Adam Newman sort of embodied everything the world and the investment community wanted at the moment in time that he was building WeWork. So, more and more over time, especially in the 21st century, the idea, Silicon Valley and investors in general have really latched onto this idea as the founder, as this like visionary being who can do remarkable feats. And, whether it's the Jeff Bezos, the Mark Zuckerberg, they can kind of create something out of nothing. And they put a lot of faith and power in the hands of these founders in a way that, during the dot-com bubble or the earlier era, over the 21st century, this has gained traction. It used to be that, a founder starts a company, they get pushed out, they bring in like a real manager. But now it's like we really have seen a lot of some of the most successful companies have been started and continued with their founders. So anyway, there was just more and more of a belief in this power of founders, and it had almost, it's gotten more and more and more extreme over time. And the founder, it's what this is, usually a white man. I think it's like, that seems to be the thing that Silicon Valley is looking for, as much as, they're trying to say and do otherwise now. Also someone, there's this idea of like what a visionary is, someone kind of eccentric, who has a very big vision, who can spell out something so much bigger than anything anyone could imagine. And Adam Newman was like maybe the most brilliant marketer of all time. And with that fundraising, he could spell out this larger than life vision that this company that subleased office space was not really an office space company. It was something that was going to change the world in every imaginable way, and make people come out of these meetings with him and be completely convinced. He had this and then he had this charisma, and I think there's something to it, and I've heard people express it in so many different ways, that he had this kind of like cool factor, that whether like it was like the bankers or investors. I remember one banker just told me, he's like, we all came into WeWork and we were like all these like lame bankers in suits, and then like Adam looks like a rock star, and like his wife and kids are like coming in from the other room. He's like in a t-shirt and ripped jeans, and like we all just want to be him. So it was a whole mix of things that came together. And I think at a different moment in time, and I think we're very much still in this moment in time, you wouldn't have had this.
Very interesting. And then if you just mentioned the bankers and the ability to fundraise and talk about investors, you also talked about just right from the get-go how, as a reporter, both you and Elliot were thinking like, where did this valuation come from years ago, right? Mm-hmm. What is happening here? So tell us also, in the ecosystem itself, kind of the larger investing ecosystem, my gosh, Adam was able to pull in early on, I mean, some really exceptional people to just buy into this, and continued throughout. So talk to us a little bit about that ecosystem and what was, generally speaking, just what was happening in the space, and then what was it specific to WeWork that got people on board?
Sure. So yeah, it was this new era, really, and I would say that it was a playbook largely that was sort of manufactured and created successfully of fundraising by Travis Kalanick of Uber. I mean, there was more and more private fundraising, larger and larger happening, but Travis Kalanick took this to a whole new level. I mean, I remember people saying that he almost kind of like weaponized capital, especially as he was going after Lyft and anyone else who wanted this. He was going to raise money larger than anyone ever like really had conceived before, as a, you know, like a venture-backed money losing company, going to more and more places, going all around the world. So Adam Newman, to a certain extent, kind of like followed Travis's lead and went after all these new places, these pools of capital that had not yet gone after the private markets before. So, but it was also an era when this was opening up. So yeah, as you mentioned, I mean, he just got from the get-go really amazing people. I mean, Benchmark this is a real estate company. He quickly saw that he was going to need a lot of money to grow, and that venture capital was an answer. You could, you know, have these money losing companies go after a really huge idea, and they were willing to finance it as long as it was like a company that was seen. You had to make it a tech company, like find the parallels you could to it, which it's funny. I mean, one of the things we laugh about a lot is that Adam, by all accounts from the people around him, was like the least like technologically sophisticated person. Like he could barely use like a laptop. You know, he could like had trouble with his cell phone. Yet he was, I mean, as far as his marketing brilliance, he knew how to sort of, people would be floored, people internally and externally, like he didn't know much about tech, but he knew how to use the language of tech and to translate WeWork through that prism to convince people it was like a tech company with, you know, with like unlimited potential, and that there was still like a finite amount of money you would have to put in to get this unlimited potential down the road. So we landed Benchmark, and I guess the thing is, as you said, it's like these marks on the company, like these stamps of approval. So you get Benchmark in there. They funded some of the best companies in the world, some of the most successful bets in Silicon Valley. They come in. He goes after the mutual funds. Mutual funds had really just around the time of Twitter had started opening up to going after private companies and had done really well. So they were looking to put more and more in. He went to China. He was sort of going around the world, finding more and more pools of capital, and ultimately got to SoftBank, which was able to write some of the biggest checks that had ever been written. One thing I found fascinating, though, is, you know, he followed the Travis Kalanick playbook. Uber had plenty of its own issues. One big differential between him and Travis, they were going after almost the same investors. He wound up landing them. But Travis made a big point of saying every step of the way, I'm not selling one single share of this. I totally believe in this company. Adam went to these same investors, raised a ton of money from them, got them to believe in his whole vision, but then also was selling shares of his company, and they didn't really care. I mean, or they would, but not enough. He always said, you know, fine, don't come in and invest. There's like 10 people waiting behind you. And he knew how to mobilize FOMO very well.
So interesting. So interesting. Also, for the audience, I forgot to mention, please feel free to comment, but also most especially ask some questions as we go along if you want to. We'll have a little time with Maureen for Q&A at the end, but also we can interject them as we're moving forward. I was reading through a couple of reviews just on this investor thought, and there was one review in The Real Deal, and I found it really interesting because they started out positioning the investors. It was straight onto the investors. This particular author highlights Diamond, Son, and Bin Salman. And he says, their outside insecurities and ambitions helped create an environment that became rocket fuel for a young, hyper-charismatic founder, et cetera, et cetera. And really, I mean, the whole premise is he almost places the most immediate blame on these sets of investors and really the larger ecosystem. And I'm sure that you can to some extent agree with him on that. But what do you it's hard to ask this question because there's just so much in this scenario. But what do you think it was when people were investing? Is it an insecurity? Was it the coolness factor? And most importantly, why do you think, what were some of the reasons you think that nobody stopped and said, hold on, to start, what about this valuation? And then as all of the stuff started coming in, especially what everybody learned at IPO had been happening in the past, why were no brakes applied?
It's a great question. I feel like it's like the question of what happened every step of the way. That's just so like mind-boggling as we unpack it. Even still, as I think back on it, I think there are a bunch of things. I think you said the insecurities, his cool factor, but really there's just, and there still is so much money chasing after, what in theory is just like a limited supply of good ideas. And I think there is just this fear of missing out on the next Facebook, the next Amazon, and, the next Tesla, even though obviously a lot has been made in the public companies, but, and this idea that just give him the money and he'll figure it out. Like, why spend time on these red flags if this guy is going to create like $1 trillion company or something? Like, why are we going to get too worked up over that? So I think Adam Newman always managed to find the next person who would believe in him, who could hand him over money, even as some people got sort of frustrated by him along the way. It didn't really matter. There was always going to be someone else who he could convince. And I think that it almost became like a runaway train in some ways. Like he would bring new people onto it, convince them of this new valuation, that it was right. And he was obsessed with that. Get new money, go after new opportunities. So, I mean, we sort of would think about him as we were writing the book as like a magician, like, his whole like sleight of hand. Don't look here, like maybe our core product isn't doing that well, but we're going to go into like apartment buildings and everyone's going to be living in this. So like, don't worry about the fact that we haven't hit any of our metrics that we've promised over years. We'll get to this new thing. But then in terms of the runaway train, time went on and there are people already on this train who, even with their skepticism, even with frustration with him as he was doing crazier and crazier things, whether they were sitting on the board or investors, our sense is like, what are you going to get from standing up to him if you could just ride this wave until you got out at the IPO? And the other interesting thing I think is like the real like shorthand on Wall Street and investment circles is like, there's like the smart money, which is like these like big institutional investors and, JP Morgan's asset management arm and hedge funds and who have sovereigns. And then there's the dumb money, which is like the retail investors who would come in at IPO. And ironically, it's like the retail investors and like the investors in the public markets were the ones who really saw the red flags and saw the numbers and were like, this isn't happening. And I think there was a sense it could just pass the buck, cash out, get to the public markets and whatever, they'll let them figure it out then, but we'll have made our money.
God, there is so much in that is, wow, does this industry need to figure out that? I mean, you're seeing it with the statement that you made that really rung to me was, what is anybody going to gain by standing up to him if they can just write it out to an IPO? And that right there is a really remarkable thought. And it happens. We see Facebook, we see Uber, that is a really interesting like psychology that I think probably unfortunately happens a lot more than it doesn't happen. Especially as it's bigger and more funding and all of the stuff. So really, really interesting. Let's turn a little bit internally, because certainly you've got this ecosystem in which this all happened. And then, boy, do you have an internal situation that's equally as interesting in terms of running a company. Give us just a rundown, probably of some of like the most prevalent internal processes, culture, whatever really drove this. And because you had employees on board up until the end, and you had all sorts of things being witnessed, just that type of stuff. So talk to us internally, most prevalent things, most kind of maybe not surprising, but that could be interesting too. But yeah, give us a sense of internal.
Sure. I mean, just for starters, I think from the very beginning, it was kind of like Adam Newman and WeWork, his creation defied gravity, like constantly. We talked about the investment side, but the whole other side was, he was raising this money, but they were opening locations. And from day one, they were really struggling to get their first location open, to negotiate with the landlord. And he was talking to everyone about when we're global, they're like, well, even internally, they were like, we can barely get this first one done. Like, you're totally crazy. And Adam Newman, each step of the way, would push people like so far beyond what they thought they could do. And I mean, this is, a lot of startups are like this, but I think this was kind of like on steroids. Like, he would be like, we're opening this building, some rational time frame would, even like a fast time frame would be 6 months. And he would be like, no, we're doing it in 3. And it would get done. I mean, it would be messy and bumpy. And often he wouldn't really do much of the work, but he knew how to motivate people and like push people so far beyond what they all thought they could do collectively. Like, he was an inspirational leader in a lot of ways. And I think especially at the beginning, he really got people like pumped up. He really made them feel part of something. So I think that was a positive. And so I think then that kind of fed into his, his own mythology. But even within the company, it was like, all right, he's told us we didn't even believe we would get here, and now we're here. So yeah, he's saying this crazy thing, but like, why are we going to doubt him now? I mean, and I'll take this goes even in like while we were reporting this book. I mean, this is when things obviously went so crazy, and his sort of narcissism and some of his like messianic tendencies and beliefs about himself. But he was saying that he thought the first Middle East peace accord would be signed into WeWork, and he would be the one to broker it. And a senior person close to him, we like mentioned this in passing during an interview, and he was like, it's not that crazy. Like, he's really powerful. I was like, you really believe, you don't think that's crazy? And this is after the whole thing's fallen apart.
Yeah, it's interesting as you moved closer and closer to IPO, if you were to think about, especially that upper, maybe quote, inner circle, were flags not raised more because they were just so still bought into it? Was it that the culture really didn't allow for dissent? Where do you think, like, the further it got along, what was there anything that anybody could have done? Number one, just as you mentioned with the investors, was there a sense that things could have been done? or should have been done? What was happening internally with the team on that?
Sure. So I guess two parts to that, like just in terms of the people around him, yes, like people bought into such a huge extent, many people. And there, people would describe it too as like, you were just like basking in the sun when you were in his good graces. Like it was just like the place you wanted to be. You felt like you were on top of the world, but he had this inner circle that there are a few people who stayed in it, but a lot of times it was a very like precarious place to be. People would be in, suddenly people were out, they were kind of traumatized by it. Like he had utter control and he kept things so like off, everybody's so off kilter, bringing people kind of in and out that there was no one to like speak truth to power, because then you were just like sort of marginalized. So I think that it was both like he had true believers, but then maybe if you woke up and weren't, you were sort of marginalized or put like, even if you stayed in, you weren't in the inner circle and couldn't really influence it. But I would say, I see Allison saying something about the boards of places.
Yeah.
I do think like a lot of people, it's like almost like collective inaction. A lot of people could have stopped it potentially, or just kept maybe like forced some sort of wake up call potentially. You never, hindsight's 2020, but what we noticed from the book was like at all those critical moments until literally like days before the IPO, people didn't do it. And the board in particular, I mean, Allison makes a great point. It's like, that's what a board is for. And what we saw consistently was like this thought, and it would be articulated supposedly like out loud at board meetings and to other people. And we heard this on enough occasions that it was like, yeah, we didn't think he needed a $65 million top of the line private jet, something that historically almost no private company pre-IPO CEO has ever gotten, that he ultimately used. A lot of it was like to take vacations and go surfing all over the world. And yeah, we thought it was a bad idea, but he had super voting shares. So why, it's not worth like ruffling feathers or like upsetting him, because it's not going to do anything anyway. So every vote was unanimous. So it's like, what if you did stand up? What if you all voted against it? You have power. And I felt like they just gave away their power to him. And I mean, when you look at this board of directors, it was an all male board, which obviously came under a lot of heat for this like mission driven company that was like going to change the world. That it's like an all male board, but everyone was afraid to stand up to him. And these were very impressive people, each in their own right. So I do think like in terms of what can be done going forward, I agree that boards need to be held accountable. I mean, that's really your job. You're getting paid. You're supposed to oversee the CEO and question them. And if you can't even do so much as to vote against something you are saying is not a good idea, like what are you doing?
Yeah. Yeah. One huge area that probably the industry should look at really deeply is board accountability. And also the point you mentioned, super shares. But again, like I hate to bring up Facebook yet again, but they have a founder situation where the literal voting shares, it cripples any outside forces. And so that I think is really interesting. And you mentioned some of his behavior is, let's be probably pretty straightforward on this. Much of his behavior is narcissistic in turnover of inner circle. And as soon as you're out, you are out. And, volatility and continual pulling in and evangelizing and using, charisma to continue to pull whatever that internal circle is. And if you can do that for long enough and manage the turnover, so to speak, super, super interesting. Let's chat a little bit more internally to the general culture. So once you get outside of this internal circle, we shared an excerpt, quite apropos to our particular audience, but classic situation of a female engineer who had voiced Anya in your in the book, had voiced dissent, and then was through HR slowly pushed out. But talk to us, and I'm going to post that excerpt that we have up. Talk to us a little bit about down inside the ranks. What was the culture that was happening? A lot of people on board, but definitely people dissenting. Was it a classic? Was it very much WeWorks? What happened? What was happening there?
Wait, sorry, a classic? What was
just sort of like, was it sort of just a classic, you're in or you're out, with some microaggressions, that type of thing? Was it a very WeWorks specific culture that was happening throughout the extent of the organization? Yeah, sort of in that realm.
Sure. I mean, so up at the senior levels and things, yeah, it was like an Adam in, out, narcissism, whatever that was. But throughout, yeah, this like the WeWork culture was work hard, play very hard. And that was, just got more and more, I think, toxic as time went on. And I'm sure it was at the beginning, but it seemed like, with a smaller group, there were more, it sounded like more kind of, people bought into it. I think you bring more and more people on. It's still very culty, but it was like, I mean, examples we hear, they had this summer camp. Adam always liked to say, oh, and he never got to go to American summer camp, so he'll have it for all the employees. And first it was up at a camp that was owned by his wife's family. They would take everyone up there, have music, tons of alcohol, drugs, everything. And people would sleep in tents. And obviously, like, uncomfortable situations were created for employees. And then I think it just got more and more kind of, I mean, it was fun for some people, amazing. And people would post it on Instagram. It was like the greatest time of people's lives. But yeah, you're putting employees, forcing them into also uncomfortable situations. And then that seemed to get kind of more and more extreme. It got like more and more larger than life. I mean, just taking summer camp is like a vignette of the culture. They went to these like huge like parks in outside of England, and thousands and thousands of employees would come. There would be like 6 to a tent. The toilets were like overflowing. I mean, it was fun. They had amazing things. Like they had like Lin-Manuel Miranda, all these cool groups. And, but there were in like situations where people were made to feel uncomfortable, particularly women. You heard situations like that. It was mandatory to go, and they were watching you, and people would have had like a baby or, things that they had to do, weren't allowed to get out of it. Adam and Miguel, his co-founder, and some other senior people were like, they had these like the most elaborate places where they stayed. And it was sort of he always said me versus we, like we're all part of this we culture. You give up yourself to be part of the we. And it was like Adam and his family were in these like beautiful, like, I forget exactly what, like outdoor, like camps, up on a hill overlooking all the employees. And one year I'm remembering that his wife had just had a baby. So he left summer camp early, but no one else was allowed to. The culture just seemed to get like worse and worse on many different levels, while like the cultiness of like them having ideas of what employees should want and go after, it became more and more intense about them sort of pushing that out to the employees.
So let's talk a little bit about kind of the end and the downfall. For those of us who might not have followed a little bit, can you give us a super high level how it sort of ended? Days up, a whole bunch of stuff is found out, IPO falls through, Adam's on the hook, resignation. Talk to us a little bit about some of the details.
Sure.
There.
So basically the downfall was sort of precipitated and accelerated when in August 2019, to go public, you have to release like a prospectus. It's called an S1 that shows your financials, makes a lot of disclosures about the executive team, their relationship with the company, and yeah, all sorts of various disclosures about the company. That comes out in mid-April, and mid-August 2019, and the world kind of goes like berserk. Like it was a company everyone was waiting for to see what it would be like. Highly anticipated IPO. First of all, just the numbers come out. They're losing more money than they're generating in revenue. Their losses just keep on getting bigger and bigger and bigger. The sheer numbers like absolutely shocked people. Then you go through it and you see like the litany of kind of conflicts of interest and weird things that Adam Newman has done with the company. There's all these related party transactions. He's like purchased buildings and leased them back to WeWork. He tries to trademark the name We, and for a company that's so mission driven and gets paid $6 million in stock for the license to this name. You kind of go through one by one. It's all like completely things that just jump out and shock people. He's taken so much money out of the company. And Elliot and I had actually written an article a few months before outlining that he had taken out almost $1 billion from the company. They don't even disclose all of that, but they disclose a lot. He has $500 million-ish, like a loan from the bank, like just the amount of money that he's taken out, his weird related party transactions. The world, people are just so flipped out and really, it's almost like his time is up. His magic show is over. The whole document in black and white gives like immediate skepticism. So they're still trying to go out and take this thing to market. And I would just say another like big piece of the puzzle then, there's a lot of skepticism anyway, a lot of nervousness about Adam and the company. So it's almost like making like it's made a mockery of itself from, and then they use all this like lofty language that's like dedicated to the energy of we, like just crazy stuff that you don't really see in an IPO prospectus. But then Elliot, my co-author, had really been working on a piece for a really long time, just about Adam Newman and his leadership style. The quick summary of it, this piece leads off with an anecdote about him flying on a private jet to Israel. And there's like a ton of marijuana on board. At the end of right when they land in Israel, they stuff it in a cereal box. They don't want to like let go of what they have not used. Him and his colleagues on the plane. It's found. The pilot and staff are totally flipped out. They're not allowed to take the jet back home. They have to get like another rental jet back from Israel. Basically, that story comes out in the days leading up to the IPO. There's enough skepticism anyway. I get a call from a banker right after the story comes out, and like a big titan of Wall Street who's not involved in the IPO. And he was like, I just to tell you, Adam, this company will never go public. I read that story. Adam will not be CEO in like 24, 48 hours. And I was like, wait, really? What? And he's like, it's a felony to transport drugs on a plane. It's been in the Wall Street Journal that this happened and Adam was involved in it. It's like too much of a liability to go and buy the IPO. It's too much of a liability if you're like JP Morgan and the bank standing behind him. And it wasn't 24 hours. It was more like, 3 days or something. But Adam resigned. The IPO was postponed. And he was quickly gone as CEO, but not forgotten because he had these super voting shares. The company was kind of teetering on the verge of bankruptcy. SoftBank had a huge investment in the company and they had to find a way to save it. So as part of that, they had to put a big infusion of capital in, and they sort of gave Adam Newman this package, a huge one, that helped him. And as part of it, he said he would give up his super voting shares and the company could live to see fight another day.
Yeah. And Maureen, can you just state with a little more specificity some of what was in that package that
Sure.
he walked through?
And someone, I think Tori was mentioning that in the chat that he had his first big interview earlier today. He did it with Andrew Ross Sorkin of the New York Times as part of the Deal Book Conference. And he asked him a lot about this. But it was an interesting interview. You can all see it. It's out there. I just tweeted it before, but the exit package basically was like giving him the opportunity to sell a portion of his shares. They were going to buy shares from everyone, do the secondary offering. So for him, it was like almost $1 billion. It was 800 something. They gave him this like consulting contract that was like $180 million. That was essentially supposedly pretty critical. He even said as much today for him to agree to give up his shares. I mean, his super voting shares, and just make his shares regular. And then he had like a $500 million loan from JP Morgan. SoftBank took it over and gave him a new loan. So it was an exit package of, well north of $1 billion between loans and stock sales and this consulting contract. And I mean, it's a huge number no matter what. As a company, he obviously built a huge company, but at that moment it was teetering on bankruptcy, on the verge of bankruptcy. They had almost no cash. They knew they were running out of cash, and as part of it, they were also going to lay off thousands of people. So I think it was a huge package, but with this backdrop, I think it was just, beyond shocking and kind of horrifying to a lot of people, especially people within the company who not only were they not going to see to make riches from the IPO or whatever it was, they thought they were promised like a nice payout, that it would be a good IPO. You never know about that. But then also tons of people were losing their jobs.
Yeah. And you can imagine some of the conversations we had in our circles, especially now that we've got Toronto's going through trial. And Ellen Powell wrote a great article sort of comparing the two, or certainly comparing Elizabeth Holmes' treatment to maybe a collective group of male CEOs, and saying, Elizabeth Holmes does deserve where she is. But what we should all be paying attention to is the difference between what Elizabeth Holmes is going through now and the lack of accountability on the part of many of these large tech giant CEOs as they exit and Adam Newman is the pinnacle almost of that, of what happened under his leadership. And
sorry.
No, go ahead.
I agree that there is some sort of like, there is some sort of sexism, broadly speaking, in terms of these payouts. And what happens to him versus other people and women in general, I think it just get tarnished so much more from making mistakes. That said, I do see a huge difference. I read that piece, and I thought it was an interesting thing to think about. But the one other piece of that is, what we were saying with the investors and the board, Adam Newman, for all the insane stuff he did show, like, he wasn't on the margins, he was lying, but he had all these promises that he made that he never fulfilled. And the board, everyone signed off on everything, but it was like legit, versus Elizabeth Holmes. In fairness, from everything we know, put people's lives in danger and literally lied to everyone around her. Like, I almost think the story with Adam is crazier in some ways, because for what he didn't lie about. Like, he almost was like telling the truth to people and saying one thing, but they had some of the smartest investors in the world could see the numbers, yet believed what this guy was telling them.
The title of your book, Delusion.
Yeah, exactly. Versus Elizabeth, like, things were hidden. And again, like,
yes,
I think it's there are a lot of bad things that happen, but to literally like be putting people's lives in jeopardy, there's a big differential.
Oh,
there.
Agreed.
Yeah, the fraud.
Where I see the big sort of grievance in that scenario is the actual size of Adam Newman's, whether it was lying or delusion. Mm-hmm. That was so remarkable. Mm-hmm. And that's really kind of the the extent of the gap is like
Yeah.
a lot there. Because I do agree with you on where you're coming from with Holmes, for sure. And just as Ellen Powell mentioned, like it's not that she shouldn't be there where she is now. It's just such a gap.
Yeah.
So wonderful. We've got a couple more minutes, Maureen. I do want to leave a couple of minutes for Q&A. So throw them in the chat if you've got them. To close out, and again, like, my God, we could talk about this for so long. Can't wait for the movie, everybody. I'd love to do, you can take this however you want, but again, we've got a lot of founders, we've got a lot of investors in our audience. What would you say to them, and or kind of like top couple of things for the industry, whether it's what not to do, where do we need to focus to, for in 20 years from now, to make these things and this system more healthy and functioning correctly, both from a market perspective, from a culture perspective, anything? Where should we be focusing after we've watched this huge dramatic downfall?
I mean, I guess, number one, this like infallibility of founders, I think should just be questioned every step of the way. Like they do have too much power. There should be questions around super voting shares. It's almost like it almost seems like pretty extreme not to give a founder super voting shares, or not just to go along with it, versus the opposite of that. So I think there needs to be more scrutiny, and which I don't know what's going to make that happen, because again, as we said, there's like so much money chasing after these opportunities, and everyone's still so afraid of missing out. I think that due diligence, it's like we've seen time and time again, but especially in this case, that, Fidelity's mark of, like, there's humans at all of these places making decisions. There's Fidelity, SoftBank, Harvard's endowment, like whatever, all these people that you think it's like it's opposite of a red flag. It's a stamp of approval. If they think this thing is fine, we'll just follow them blindly into it. It seems like investors have to do their own diligence, and that those stamps of approval aren't necessarily enough and shouldn't be. And I just think more accountability all around. I mean, we were talking about the directors earlier. It's like directors really should be held accountable. I don't know how you do that. It seems like they should play a big role. And we've seen that time and time again about them sort of, abdicating their responsibilities. So, the question, of course, is like, what is regulation going to do, and where can these things be regulated? It's so tricky because I don't even know. And I mean, the weird thing that I think that we've seen since WeWork is, the private markets there's less scrutiny of them. You get to see fewer items, more can happen, but we're seeing pretty crazy things in the SPAC market right now. We're seeing, not to pick on them really at all, but like Rivian, a company like Rivian, I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but it's just pretty wild at this moment that it's like pre-revenue essentially, and it's like going to be a $60+ billion company, it looks like, in its IPO. There's just, I don't know. We're in this really wild time in the markets, and I don't know what's going to cause this wake up. And I don't know, there's no clear, obvious way for like for regulation to do this necessarily.
Yeah, one of the things we talk a lot about, because we're earlier stage, both with our organization and with our venture fund, is really thinking early about your policies and processes and your culture. I still remember, an interview, several interviews, I think he covered this a lot, but the late Tony Hsieh, who, arguably he had some certain visions on culture, but the reason he dove into that when he started Zappos was he had grown his original company, Link Exchange, to a point of just 100 people. And part of the reason he sort of wanted to get out and sell it was he realized he had created such a toxic culture at only 100 people that he couldn't reverse it. And I always sort of think about that, you know, to broadly touch on the problem is what can early stage founders and investors also do and think about that could make an impact downstream as some of these things are happening. I don't necessarily have the answer, but always something we're thinking about too, because that right there is important. That and you can read it in this book as you lay out the early days of Adam Newman. You can read it. So we have a. Oh, go ahead, Maureen.
Okay. Yeah, no, it's like even the super voting shares are given away early.
Yep. We've got a question from Roy. Are there any legislatures recommending due diligence regulations on private companies? Hard to imagine that no one's jumped into this fray with proposals.
You know, I don't know of any, and maybe Kate, I don't know what you've seen of this. I mean, I agree there probably are. I haven't seen or heard of anything gaining a whole lot of traction, really. That seems like, yeah. I mean, the SEC talks about it, but it seems like they've got a lot on their, you know, it seems like their focus, if anything, for a while, you know, and probably is still like SPACs and crypto. You know, there's a lot that they're going after, and it's slow getting this.
Yeah, and one of the areas I've thought about when I think about this question too is there is certainly, as we all know, a huge focus right now on regulation and antitrust and all that good stuff. And I wonder if during or as a result of that what seems to be a large priority for legislatures, if that might shake out to be one area that they home in on, sort of as they're going through the process. As we talked about Facebook before in this particular case, like that certainly plays a factor in what's happening here. So, I've been watching that.
Yeah, that'll be interesting.
Anything else? We've got Maureen for 3 minutes, but I think it looks like we're probably all set for questions. Maureen, thank you so much. Everybody should go out and get this book. I was able to post it at the top here, and I'll repost it again. Absolutely go out and get this book. Like I said, beach reading if you're that type of person, but also really important, honestly, lessons to be learned from this. And thank you, both you and Elliot, for chronicling this in some really, really good detail. That detail, I think, is important to be thinking about if we want to try to make a healthier ecosystem moving forward. So thank you so much again.
Thank you so much for having me. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah. And for everybody, we will be transcripting this in the next couple of weeks for everybody. Again, go out and get the book. And we've got a couple more pieces of programming through the rest of the year that you will all be hearing about, most of them in December. So hope you can join us one last time before the end of the year. And we will call it quits today. Have a great rest of your day. Thanks again, Maureen.
All right.